friend of mine told me that when giving a talk, it is important to speak in a low voice. Since one passion of mine is speedboxing, I thought I would try it like this.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the deepest that I've talked so far.
Well, or better not. Anyway, as for my main passion, I've been thinking about the world and what I want to do in it. This made me realize two things. First, the world is really messed up, much more than I would have thought. Be it world poverty, suicide and depression rates, the suffering of non-human animals, or worrying forecasts about the future. Many things don't seem to be all right at all. Most of us grow up in a bubble where things seem to be okay the way they are, but once you start questioning the status quo, it suddenly becomes glaringly obvious that the way things are is a catastrophe. Fortunately, the second thing I've learned is brighter. I realized that individuals can make a huge difference if they ask the right questions and if they put in some effort. So this is what my talk will be about. Many people who are altruistically motivated start out with some concrete idea or some favorite cause, which they then try to pursue. It is rare that people systematically think about where they can make the most difference. And given all that's going on in the world and all the things one could do, it's hard to even know where to start looking. So the feeling of being overwhelmed or incapable of making a meaningful difference is understandable. Are we even able to make a difference? I think we are. In order to see why, I'm now going to present a helpful approach. Let's call it impact through rationality. So first off, I'm going to define the two elements of that concept, impact and rationality. What does having an impact mean? It refers to how the world is different as a consequence of our decisions. And by decisions, I don't just mean the ones that explicitly feel like decisions, like choosing what apartment to rent or what job to take. By decisions, I mean basically everything. All of our life, every step we take and every step we don't take is a decision and determines our impact. But we don't want to have just any kind of impact. We want to have a positive one, of course. Despite diverging opinions in ethics, there is one core value that everybody agrees on: the reduction of unnecessary suffering. This may not cover everything, but it serves as a good focal point of what we as altruists want to accomplish as our shared goal. And when we are talking about goals, rationality comes into play. Or at least it should, because it is the science of figuring out how to best achieve our goal. Or in other words, how to win at whatever game we're playing. As we all know, humans don't always act rationally. In cognitive psychology, a systematic deviation from goal achievement is called a cognitive bias. Now let's have a look at some particular biases which play an important role in ethical questions. One of these is called scope insensitivity. Imagine there's an oil spill that kills 2,000 birds. Now put an imaginary price tag on those 2,000 birds corresponding to how much you'd be willing to pay to save them. What price tag would you put on them if it was 200,000 birds? If the actual goal is to help these birds, then we should expect a linear increase in the amount of money donated. Instead, if we ask people about the cases in isolation, then we see that the sum stays about the same for all numbers of birds, around $80. Our brains are not equipped to deal with large numbers. Even though each bird matters in itself, our brains only have so much carrying ability that at some point, the the number of victims stops affecting the intensity of our emotions. But if we want to help effectively, we can't rely on our biased, intuitive responses. We need to take numbers into account. Numbers count because individuals count. So, do we actually want to help these birds? In which case our money should scale with the number of birds? Or do we, in a more selfish way, just want to feel good about having done something? So, what's your goal in life? What is it that you'd like to see written on your gravestone? It seems to me that this has to be the most important question we can ask ourselves. Still, we often don't spend an adequate amount of time thinking about it. In order to figure out what we really care about, let's go through the following thought experiment. Would you push a button that causes two things? 1, you receive $100 in your bank account. 2, a child in Africa gets infected with a horrible disease. Most people will not push that button, and this suggests that they are not selfish. What about the second scenario? Again, pushing the button will accomplish two things. 1, $100 gets subtracted from your bank account. And 2, a child in Africa will be prevented from being infected with a horrible disease. Not pushing this button results in you keeping $100 and the child becoming sick. The choice in both scenarios is basically the same. In your heads, you decide which future world will come into existence. You can either choose a future world where you have $100 more and the child is sick, or you can choose a future world where you have $100 less and the child is healthy. If we don't push the button that would give us $100 and causes a disease in the child, that shows that the health of a child is worth more to us than $100 at our own disposal. But in that case, it would be irrational not to give up $100 in order to ensure the health of a child. It doesn't make a difference to others whether we actively cause something bad to happen or whether we omit to prevent something bad from happening. Intuitively, it might seem like there's a real difference here, but rationally considered, it's a bias, the omission bias. Put into practice, how can we rationally approach the question of how to help people most effectively? Organizations such as GiveWell are working on scientific charity evaluation. The differences in cost effectiveness between charities can be enormous. Let's take interventions against HIV as an example. This graph shows that the available interventions differ massively in terms of how much they achieve per $1,000 invested. It would be irresponsible not to consult and produce this scientific knowledge when spending our money. For instance, if we want to buy a television and we find out that the same product is priced at $500 in one store and $5,000 in another, the rational thing to do is clear. Unfortunately, similar situations in the charitable sector are not usually handled the same way. Luckily, however, there are a number of organizations pursuing a cost-effective approach. In Switzerland, for example, there's the organization EACH, which stands for Effective Altruism Switzerland. Trying to reduce the most suffering in the world requires us to take a broad perspective, search for the biggest sources of suffering out there, and find out how exactly we can prevent them. Therefore, I want to focus on an issue which seems very important and has rarely been mentioned: the suffering of non-human animals. Personally, I don't have a dog, or a kitten, or a child, or any other pet. and I don't plan to have one. But the issue is not whether I like them or not. The issue is whether they are suffering and whether I can do something about it. I simply don't want to look away anymore. I don't want to ignore the facts when the fate of innumerable creatures depends on what I do. We slaughter 60 billion land animals each year. That's 7 million every hour. Let's imagine that mentioning this number was just a bad joke and factory farming didn't exist. Would you object if I proposed an increase in culinary diversity that required, say, scientific experiments that killed 7 million animals an hour? And how is factory farming different from that? Considering the victims, it seems to me that not helping to end factory farming is as unethical as newly introducing it. Some may feel, however, that the well-being of animals shouldn't account for as much as the well-being of humans. So let's take a step back and look at the reasoning for caring about suffering in the first place. It seems to me that my suffering matters not because I belong to a particular group, such as human animals. My suffering matters because it is suffering, because it is the sort of conscious state one intrinsically desires to get out of. This is why it makes rational sense to draw the line at sentience. A sentient being is one for which it feels like something to be that being. Things that are not sentient, such as plants, very probably, or rocks, certainly, cannot be harmed like sentient beings can be harmed. Historically, our circle of concern has grown step by step. African Americans only received full legal rights after following serious efforts and protests. The fight for women's rights has been taking a long time too. Only in the year 1919, the WHO declassified homosexuality as a mental disorder, and yet none of these social problems are fully solved by now. So the historical record teaches us that discrimination is hard to spot and hard to get rid of. Our circle of concern didn't grow by itself. It had to be stretched actively by brave changemakers. And if we look at where this expanding circle has arrived, then it seems to me that the discrimination of non-human animals should be the moral issue of our time. Sometimes I wonder what people 40 years from now are going to think about us. I won't be surprised if they look back on us and ask themselves, how could they possibly have supported these torture facilities all over the globe? Jeremy Bentham summed up the crucial points as early as 200 years ago. A full-grown horse or dog is beyond comparison a more intelligent as well as a more conversable animal than an infant of a day, a week, or even a month old. But suppose the case were otherwise, what would it avail? The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? This famous quote points to the so-called argument from species overlap. One might say that humans matter more than other animals because they're more intelligent, but that's a bad argument because some humans lack many cognitive capabilities and still deserve full moral consideration, for good reason, of course. The same is true for other criteria, like the ability to speak or the ability to reciprocate. If we acknowledge that these are false criteria for treating non-humans differently, what arguments remain? What are we going to tell the pig while we unnecessarily slit its throat? Does it have the wrong number of legs, or the wrong DNA, the wrong skin color and shape? We can't seriously mean that. This reasoning would be just as biased as discrimination based on other outward criteria, such as sex or race. The ethicist Peter Singer has popularized the term speciesism to refer to this type of discrimination against non-human animals. At this point, it is important to note that opposing speciesism doesn't mean that we should treat all animals exactly equally. For instance, it is not speciesist to deny pigs the right to vote, just as it's not age is to deny babies the right to vote. So treating beings of different species differently is not speciesist if there are relevant criteria for doing so. If the suffering of a sentient animal counts at least somewhat, then the alarming prevalence of animal suffering all over the globe should be reason for devoting time and resources to this important cause. There are a number of organizations working in this area. In Switzerland, for example, there's the organization Vegan Politics, which tries to find the most effective ways to help animals. And animal suffering could generally be a very cost-effective cause. A single person that stops eating animals saves about 1,000 animals from a dreadful destiny. Estimates suggest that the lower bound of donating a single dollar to effective vegan charities is that it prevents about 100 days of suffering on a factory farm. Do you remember the button? But still, identifying and comparing potentially highly effective causes is a very hard task. Therefore, much more research is needed on that front. The Foundational Research Institute, or for short, FRI, is a quickly growing organization working on this issue, with new researchers ranging from physicists to psychologists joining in. They reduce the uncertainties we face when trying to make the biggest possible difference. One thing is certain, though. With our decisions here in our heads, we decide about how much horrible suffering there will or won't be in the world. Let us really imagine what this means in terms of the responsibility it bestows on us. Let us have impact through rationality, and therefore let us be the change makers of our time by expanding our circle of concern. Let us care about the lives of all the beings that themselves consciously care about their lives. And let us do it rationally and thus effectively. Thank you.